I'm here for is to introduce our next speaker. And the first thing I should say is it's a great honor for me to introduce this talk by Simon Buckingham Shum. I'll give you the reasons now. I met Simon a while ago when I started to get excited about learning analytics, and one of the things that caught my attention is that it is the kind of person that it's been there where no one has been before, way before you, way before anybody else. And I thought first there's like in a couple of occasions like, oh wow, this Simon fellow, he's a special, right? But then you see this systematically occurring over time, and it's like, he's really, really special. I mean, how many speakers will start a presentation with that slide? That's my point. That's my point. So, like I said, I met Simon a while ago. I've been looking at his work, and it's really, really fascinating. He's been engaged in pretty much a lot of areas within learning analytics. He's doing research in discourse analysis. He's been one of the first ones proposing visualizations for data in learning environments. He has a couple of publications, a few publications also on social learning, social learning analytics. Pretty much another one that is also my favorite, systemic adoption of learning analytics in educational institutions. So as you can see, a wide variety of topics. Another very interesting thing, and I encourage you, Simon is very open about his research. He has a very interesting collection of presentations in SlideShare that he so generously shared with everybody. And if you look at that, those are incredibly good source of information about the issues and the ideas that he's working with. I think another thing we have in common is that at some point in our recent life, we both detected that the place to be was Australia, and we decided to move here. He moved 4 months ago, 3 months. I could kind of tell the story that I moved here first and then I convinced him to come, but that would be totally a lie, so I'm not gonna go that way. But anyway, I remember sitting with him at the Opera House at some point when he was interviewing, and I could tell that he was already excited to move to a place where it has so much happening in the area of learning analytics, and I'm really glad that he decided to move here, even though he's on the other side of the street, but that's still okay. And he's currently the director, let me see if I said, the director of the Connected Intelligence Center at UTS. Before he was the Associate Director of Technology at the Open University in the United Kingdom in the Knowledge Media Institute. He's been here only for a while, but he's already got a lot of attention in his center at UTS. And I'm sure he's going to live up to the expectation and give us a great talk. So, thank you very much, Sam.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Abelardo. Maybe I should just sit down at that point before I do any damage to that profile. Yeah, I've just passed my 3-month anniversary here in Australia. And so far it's been great. And I've just about learned to figure out that every other sentence has to say look or no worries, and I've just about figured out how to say Taramara and not Tamarama, and so I'm getting there, and my kids are in school and they're making friends, so you know it's good progress. So what I want to do today is to really give you perhaps a slightly different angle on learning analytics and explore some of the dimensions to analytics that are talked about less, and just really take a kind of critical stance on it. And I'm going to be picking up really where Pip left off this morning, I think, talking about the way that the future is going to be very different from the past that we know, and which gave rise to the education system we have at the moment. And that has implications not only for what we do as educators and researchers, but of course about the way we're using technology. So I put this slide up to start with to just sort of capture some of the concerns people have about learning analytics. We have this beautiful thing on the left. It's organic. It's somewhat mysterious. That's learning. We're trying to understand learning, and then we have these AI, data mining, statistician type people who want to count everything and say, we understand that thing on the left, look. And of course, in the process, are we going to somehow reduce this to this? And it was a nice little tweet. And we'll come back to that later on. Because what if the student's progress or your performance indicators are defined by that bar chart. And you don't think that really reflects what's really going on over here. So immediately you can see the implications if technology starts to embed into our infrastructures, which describes learning in one way that we don't think has any credibility. So I've come over here, joined Connected Intelligence Center, KIC, and our job is to figure out, well, what does it mean to use learning analytics in a smart way within the university to create the kinds of learning we want to create. And we're going to be doing both research and a lot of internal strategic work as well. So it's both. I come from the human sciences, psychology, ergonomics, HCI, hypertext, collaboration tools. So I'm not actually a data miner or an AI or statistician. I sort of lurk on the edges of those. A lot of what I do is connect people up to create the kinds of teams I think we need to get to grips with this stuff. We're going to be looking a lot at transdisciplinary working, the kinds of courses we're creating at UTS. We want to create increasingly transdisciplinary courses, transdisciplinary teams, trying to figure out how to work together. We will, of course, be doing learning analytics, also looking at the way that open data and analytics impacts research more broadly. Working closely with our business intelligence units, the people who sit on the student data as it stands at the moment, try and advise the university on what's going on. Running our own courses, internal briefings, external briefings, a master's course in data science and innovation launching next year, and huge amounts of collaboration, including with people such as you, perhaps. So come to kick.uts and find out more. And I'll come back at the end to ALASI, which is the National Gathering of Learning Analytics People, which is held later on this month, 20th, 21st November. We're all very welcome. Okay, so in case your Dutch isn't up to much, that's what it says. Check the huge difference between knowing and measuring. And essentially what we've got with learning analytics is a new technology for assessment of different sorts. And so with that comes all the debate about assessment. How do you do assessment? How do you do authentic assessment? That's come up a couple of times today. If our assessment regimes are stuck in the 19th century, essentially with people writing very hard for 3 hours, that's one thing. How do we develop assessment regimes which will measure the kinds of qualities that we think will be important in the future? Okay, but before we talk about analytics in any detail, I want to talk about where we're trying to go with the vehicle before we start getting into engines and performance and dashboards. Okay. Where is it we are trying to get to with learning and education in the school system, in higher ed? And then that should direct the way in which we use analytics as a tool. Don't know if you're familiar with this acronym, VUCA. I think it comes from our good friends in the US military, but that's essentially the sort of situation that they have to deal with in a military campaign. But of course, essentially, this is what we are facing increasingly in life in general. And Manuel Castells talks about informed bewilderment. This is essentially the state in which most of our leaders, politicians live, as we all get captured and overtaken by the next disruptive innovation or revolution, or the next government policy that comes out around education. It's overwhelming. We're trying to keep up, and it's all rather confusing. But it's not going to get any easier, probably. And if this is how education is currently conceived at the moment, well-mapped, defined routes, simplified by others who will get you from A to B as fast as possible, that's their job. That works well when the world is stable, or we have a local stability, and we want to get you from A to B in the most efficient way possible. Okay. Unfortunately, the world's increasingly like this, where there is more and more unknown. Novelty, the complexity of our world, is presenting increasingly unique challenges. and improvisation and a lot of other qualities that go with that become increasingly important. And this is what employers are complaining graduates don't seem to have. This is what school leavers are missing. This is even what university graduates are missing. And so we need to try and create learning ecosystems for whitewater, if you will, where you may know a lot of curriculum and stuff. You need to know that. That's good. You may have a plan. You may be quite skilled in the technical skills. But stuff will happen, inevitably. You will fail. But do you have the capacity to improvise and to persist and bounce back stronger each time you fail? I heard earlier about the lean startup movement. Fail fast. We have students who are high-performing students who are not used to failing. They may get disoriented when they come into university and suddenly realize that they can't succeed. Or they may find themselves in a course where if they do cram and get through, essentially they can continue to succeed. But they're not used to failing, and their identity will be quite threatened when they do fail. And we have school kids like that as well. Okay. So what we're doing at the moment is, I'd like to introduce you to the idea of moving from what we know, which is familiar and comfortable, and this is as an institution, as a university, as individuals, ourselves, as lecturers, researchers, and for our students. And we want to move into unknown, strange, uncomfortable territory. And the stranger and more unknown that is, and as you approach it, the more uncomfortable it gets. And there's a word for this, which is liminal space. Limen being the word for threshold in Latin. And a lot of people think about liminal space. If you Google it, you'll find a lot of different people talking about liminal space, which gets harder the more you are in this unknown zone. So Richard Rohr talks about liminal space. Richard Rohr is actually a Franciscan priest. He talks about liminal space in terms of spirituality, in fact, right? When you've left the tried and true but not yet been able to replace it with anything else. And he writes, when you're betwixt your old comfort zone and any possible new answer, if you're not trained in how to hold anxiety and how to live with ambiguity and how to entrust and wait, you will run. Anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. Now that's quite spiritual language, which may or may not appeal to you. But the concept is equally relevant in learning, of course. A quote from a recent book. So while we initially strive to make our students feel comfortable, we must then help them balance their desire for security with the need to take risks and explore new ideas and possibilities. Rather than attempting to resolve the tension, a college should help students find their place on this precarious threshold in the liminal space between the familiar and the strange, the old and the new. And this is a very interesting concept for me. It's the process I've been through, coming from the UK to Australia. It's the process my kids are going through as they settle into a new school, etc. And I would argue that increasingly we need to design students to know how to exist and hold uncertainty, ambiguity, the emotions that generates when you're not sure quite where you're going, etc. That is essentially the name of the game. And we want to ask what kinds of people will survive or even thrive in liminal space. And we worry a lot, certainly in the school sector, about the disengaged low achievers. But we also need to worry about people like Emily, who says, I know I'm bright and I'm going to get good grades, but I worry I've become a tape recorder. I worry that once I'm out of school and people stop handing me information with questions to answer, I'll be lost. And this is a pervasive problem in the UK system, which is extremely grades-driven. And my daughter's about to go to HSC, which is just going to, compress the scope for creativity, I suspect, in many respects. And that's just the system we seem to be in at the moment. So we might want to ask, well, how are learning analytics going to help us navigate a VUCA world? How will it help me get through liminal space? How will it give me feedback as to how I'm doing? That's the big vision. I haven't got very good answers yet, but that's the way I'd like to frame this. Now, you may or may not be that familiar with learning analytics, so I'm just going to give you a few quick examples just to perhaps dispel any stereotypes. So, if you Google learning dashboard or something like that, then Google images, you can just let them wash over you. Everybody in every learning product has got a dashboard now. Lots of red, amber, and green. Everybody's counting stuff and trying to tell you how you're doing. Okay? The question, of course, for us as educators is, well, what are you counting? How does that tie to conceptual change, learning, and progress? Can I understand, just from a human interface design perspective, can I understand what I'm looking at as an educator or as a student? So a whole host of human-centered design questions come up around this stuff, as well as pedagogical learning design questions. So here's one example. If you go to Grockit.com, they will provide you with a lovely social environment with an adaptive tutor which will get you through your US GRE verbal exams. And there's extremely fine-grained feedback, probably finer grained than you'd get back from any human, personalized to me, telling me how I'm doing on my sentence completion, vocabulary, antonyms, short passage, etc. Okay? So intelligent tutoring, adaptive tutoring, you know about this here as well at UTS. The guys at CMU have been doing this for a long time as well. If you use their adaptive statistics tutoring system, and if you used it in a blended learning mode, where you went off, did the tutoring stuff, came together, discussed it, you could learn a full semester's worth of material in half a semester, and do at least as well, if not better, than students using the traditional approach. Okay? So the case for adaptive tutoring systems which have modeled in great depth particular mastery of skills is growing increasingly. You know, why would a human being want to compete with this and try and provide that level of personalized, timely, real-time feedback when they could be doing something else that they're much better at that a machine can't do? We could hand certain kinds of learning over to adaptive tutors. Another kind of learning analytic is predictive analytics to try and spot students who may be in danger of dropping out. And this is something that gets a lot of people very excited because lots of people care about whether students drop out of university for all sorts of reasons, including institutions. So the work at Purdue University, where they have a traffic light system embedded into Blackboard, gives students a red, amber, or green light when they log in, which tells them are they on track or not, and what to do about it if they're on amber or green or red. And that's based on a statistically validated model that said the students who were most likely to drop out had the following kinds of profiles based on the model using these kinds of measures. You know, the CMS being the content management system, the VLE, right? So the PhD that John Campbell did was to identify the most predictive variables of the use of the online system, combined with some traditional prior attainment measures, and algorithms can then start to predict with reasonable accuracy, and that's quite old data now, which students might be at risk and step in and make them aware in a more timely way. But here's a completely different example where we have a sort of electronic sticky notes. Students are given some instructions and they have to organize their sticky notes in the affinity groups that they think make sense. They then share those. The algorithm is now producing a sort of aggregate and then produces a visualization that shows to what extent people seem to be all agreeing and to what extent there seem to be differences. Okay, so that was a paper at the Learning Analytics Conference recently. Now, so no one's being graded here. No one's being flagged as at risk of dropping out. The algorithm is simply doing some smart stuff to produce aggregate views in order to provoke a classroom conversation. Okay, so a very different example again. And a fifth example, just to really force the issue, is supposing you've got students going out on a field trip and they're supposed to be examining the flora and fauna, right? Would it be relevant to know to what extent students got down on their knees and burrowed around on the ground? And would it be useful to know to what extent they were actually looking up and observing the life above their heads? Well, now we can do 3D posture analysis. Okay? So a completely different example again. So if you went off into the woods and came back and had barely got down on your hands and knees, that's a warning sign. Okay? You just didn't understand how you were supposed to be doing. So now we're getting it embodied, situated, etc. Okay, so lots of interesting stuff happening. There's a whole new community, a whole new professional society. People are doing all sorts of sexy stuff with technology. But there's a but. And the but is around, well, to what extent are these technologies embodying certain worldviews about what we're trying to measure here? So the social critical scientists, the social informaticians, the social studies of technology people, and others are worrying about the fact that we are embedding into technology all sorts of things which are not neutral, objective, or automated. That whenever you build a coding scheme, a database schema, an algorithm, you're building in a worldview. Okay? And that's not news, in a sense, right? We've known that for a long time. But that's part of what it means to create a learning analytics system. Now, whilst for us academics that may not be news, when the vendor rolls up at your IT department and shows them your dazzling dashboards, the question is that technology, is that platform embodying a certain worldview, certain kinds of assessments? What are those bar charts going to be, which will suddenly be in front of lecturers? And what kinds of sanctions and rewards might come to be associated with those? So, if you work in the UK in a school, from the Department for Education, well, it was called that at the time, will give you all sorts of data about your school. It will show you things like who's achieving level 4 or above in mathematics, and who's slow moving in orange, who's falling behind in pink, who's at level 5, they're doing very well. Okay, that's a nice visualization. But of course we know that that's just one picture of what's going on in the school. And here we have a child who, the sorts of kids that we used to work with in the school where I was the chair of governors. This kid has a mum who's on drugs. This kid has to feed his younger sister before he goes to bed. This kid's been picked up off the streets, wandering around at 1 a.m. because his mum sent him out to get drugs. This kid is not learning very well in school in terms of that diagram, but maybe he's doing extremely well on some other respects because of the commitment and the care that the staff are showing. Maybe he's actually showing real curiosity. Maybe he's actually mentoring other kids like him now that he's improving. Maybe he's showing much greater resilience when he's stretched and challenged than he used to when he used to just throw the chair across the classroom. That's invisible on the grade sheet. But the grade sheet is what the teachers are judged by, and the grade sheet is what the head teacher will lose their job on. So that's where analytics start to get very edgy. Accounting tools shape the reality they measure. They don't just document it in a neutral way. So as soon as there are any high-stakes measurement systems with sanctions associated, we have to position ourselves to maintain our visibility. Otherwise, you become invisible, and that's not a good thing. Okay, so in what senses can we think about analytics shaping the educational ecosystem? So here's a bunch of ways. Systemically, we could be changing the dynamics of the education system because we go from a learning design of some sort, informal or formal, often informal, developed by an academic, using some mix of these with some desired outcome. We are now accelerating the feedback loop back to the academic, but also back to the student, which is very interesting. Because if we're giving the right kind of feedback to the student, they could be taking more responsibility for their work. They could be correcting mid-course rather than only when they get the test, which is done periodically, etc. So systemically, we may be changing the system. Every organization in certain sectors have just had to completely re-architect the way they work. They become, in a sense, a more sentient organization. They're sensing the environment faster, they're sensing their internal processes faster, the feedback loops are coming back, and at every level in the organization, people are monitoring what's going on. Okay? So it's a sort of a complex systems view would say that we are moving from becoming a rather inert, unintelligent, unadaptive organism to a more complex, adaptive organism, if this is done well. There's an issue around who gets to interpret these representations. Who gets to see what everybody's doing? Is that just the educator who gets to see what everybody's doing? Does the student get to see what their peers are doing? Would there be a pedagogical value in showing the student what they're doing relative to their peers? How do you protect anonymity suitably? How do you avoid crushing a student by showing how miserably they're doing compared to their peers versus actually encouraging them and provoking them to greater heights? Lots of interesting ethical issues there as well. I've mentioned this, but representations and analytics can impact politically. So, these representations are the things that head teachers live or die by in the UK. You will lose your job if that goes too long into the red after about 2 years, and that's it. So it's a huge disincentive to innovation, trying new things, because you're always worrying about these grades. PISA, of course, the politicians get deeply exercised about PISA whenever it comes out, and we could have a good old debate about the extent to which PISA is measuring the kinds of things we care about as well, and how you get to the top. Ontologically, so systemically, politically, ontologically, you are shaping education because your model can talk about many different things. Grades. Here is a simple ontology for structuring a discussion in a knowledge-building environment, raising questions, ideas, pros and cons. That doesn't permit social interaction, really. It's very task-focused. It's very focused on argumentation. Did a lot of work on that. I'll talk a bit more about this. These are kinds of dispositions which we're interested in. So these are talking about very, very different things, and you will choose analytics to reflect what you care about. And as we know from Jeff Bowker and Lee Starr's brilliant work, sorting things out, what a great name for a book, sorting things out. Classification systems provide both a warrant and a tool for forgetting. What to forget, how to forget it. The argument comes down to asking not only what gets coded in, but what gets coded out of a given scheme. So they thought a lot about how our information infrastructures they just become invisible. They sink into the background. But somebody has made decisions about what standards there are, what gets included, what gets read out. Brilliant work around the professionalization of nursing, for example. Nurses had to make themselves visible in the new evidence-based culture that dominates medicine. So they had to develop taxonomies of what nursing skills look like. So there was a nursing skills code for the use of humor by the bedside. And they'd always have to check that box off. This is what classification schemes can do and what you have to do to maintain your visibility sometimes. Algorithms, of course. What are the thresholds, the samples, the relationships, the patterns that we're looking for? What assumptions about a learner is embedded in an algorithm? If it's actually a recommendation engine, to what extent is it grounded in learning sciences or educational research where you would take a learner next, right? So we can look with excitement at what's going on in recommendation engines in Amazon and Netflix and so forth. But of course, we really want recommendation engines and analytics that are based on solid educational practice and research. And of course, this is not limited to learning. So if you go to governingalgorithms.org, great event, where they worried deeply about what do we talk about when governing algorithms. So they're playing on the idea that algorithms are increasingly governing our lives, as well as how on earth do we regain control over these things. And we would equally want to ask the same about learning analytics in the future. So, they talk about, is an algorithm a technology or an epistemology? They worry about secrecy, obscurity, and inscrutability. How do we really know how the government's algorithms work, or Google's, or Facebook's? They worry about agency, automation, and accountabilities. They wonder if there are different genres of algorithm. And they worry about normativity, bias, and values. All of those are completely relevant to learning and education. So there's a wider discourse growing around algorithms, which is worth chasing up if that's of interest. And finally, all this stuff's got to be made visible to a human being at some point. So we're into the realm of SemiOptics at this point, right? You can use and abuse visualizations. You can hide information and you can highlight information. And so who is going to engage with these lovely visualizations, and what sense will they make of them, and what action might they take on the basis of it? And so there's a great information visualization challenge to work with learning designers on this. So analytics shape education in a myriad ways. And given that's the case, when we buy our learning platforms with these algorithms in them, with these dashboards in them, have we just outsourced our core business? That's the question that Candice Thiel at Stanford asks. Right? If our core business is learning design and formative feedback and summative feedback and interventions, and increasingly these are going and embedded in products that we buy, what have we just done? So, the next step is to say, learning analytics could shape education. Well, learning analytics do shape education unavoidably. You cannot not have an ontology. You cannot not have values built into an algorithm. But is it really going to change things? Or, in 10 years' time, we'll be looking back on learning analytics as just another hype bubble, and essentially nothing's really changed in the way we do stuff. Are we going to use analytics to reinforce current practice? Or possibly, could we use them to accelerate the shift to new ways of learning, which most of you care about deeply, and actually see the kinds of changes that we want to see? So your worldview will determine your use of ICT, goes without saying, and hence analytics. And worldview in the world of learning can't really escape the sort of magic triangle of epistemology, assessment regimes, and pedagogy. So, this learning analytics sits right in the middle here. You can't escape that. You have made commitments on these dimensions, whether or not you're aware of them. And we talk a lot in more detail about that in this paper. The slides will be available afterwards. So our analytics go faster stripes on the current models of education, which are tuned to go very fast from A to B or around a closed loop at Le Mans. Okay? So those vehicles are that's the dream machine if you want to go very fast on known territory. Or is that vehicle increasingly starting to look like this? The good old, I think it's a Reliant Robin, and that looks like a UK street somewhere. Okay. Do we need these kinds of vehicles now, which will help, and this is the intellectual apparatus and the dispositions that students need increasingly to cope with that white water? And how are learning analytics going to help us not only put go faster stripes on the current models, because we do still need to teach students as efficiently as possible certain core curriculum. They do still need to master tasks and skills. That's not in question, but it's just not enough anymore. So we need to get super efficient at that in order to release time and resources and energy to teach these other skills. So for example, here's how the epistemological, pedagogical assessment thing really kicks in. In Denmark, the high school students are online with computers. Right? That would be illegal here, or in Britain probably. Right? Now, what allows you to make a step like that? It's a fundamental shift in what it is you think it means to know and display competence. Right? And so, you know, they have been piloting that, and it's now going mainstream as far as I understand. Right? Because it's not about reproducing and regurgitating. It's about demonstrating your ability to make sense, find information, forage, filter, synthesize. We'll come back to that ability in a little while. So if our designs and uses of analytics are going to be fundamentally shaped by our worldview, that's a bit depressing, because most of our teachers do not have a very progressive educational worldview. We might worry a lot about that. We know how hard it is to change what goes on in universities and in schools. So here's some work from Chris Goldspink at Incept Labs here in Sydney. Brilliant little outfit. Complex systems thinking and radical ideas about the future of learning. And they've been studying not learning dispositions, but teachers' dispositions. How do teachers conceive their job? And from studying in depth 500 school teachers, they characterize two different types. There's the script-driven teacher and the dynamic design teacher. And this is, in a way, a visual analytic that if you showed this back to a teacher, it might actually help them see something. Right? So the teachers who are strong on the blue are really demonstrating in their classroom from expert observation those kinds of qualities. And the teachers whose job it is, as far as they're concerned, to teach the facts, the curriculum, and deliver it, in the way that they behave and the way that they talk, they are script-driven. All right? And that's an interesting example of how a visual analytic might talk back and actually make visible something you weren't aware of. And I'm working with Abelardo and Chris and others on what kinds of tools might we use to surface a worldview like that, to feed back to trainee teachers, perhaps. So most of our teachers and university academics are rewarded for teaching probably on a more script design basis, but there are, of course, lots of shining examples. So I'm going to finish off with two examples of analytics that I'm particularly interested in and which I feel are getting at some of the qualities that we care about in higher education. One of them is about your ability to write. So everyone I'm talking to at UTS has got a real challenge with getting really good writing out of students, right? Whether they're international students or quite high ability students. There's just such a challenge, and they're biting my hand off for language technologies that could help give rapid formative feedback on student writing. And that's something that we're going to be really majoring on. And this demonstrates your ability, critical thinking, your ability to construct narrative, engage in argument, synthesize conflicting perspectives. These are some of those future work skills that people are crying out for. These are the qualities that we are looking for in people as they go out into a very complex world. So when you look at the literature on student writing, yes, of course, students have got to demonstrate all that stuff in black, but it seems they have deep misconceptions about the importance of argumentation and rhetorical moves and making your thinking visible as you take your reader on a journey. And so argumentation is something we're very interested in. And so we got extremely interested in technology coming out of Xerox labs in Grenoble, because they have a very powerful natural language processing product called ZIP. And one of the aspects of that parser is a rhetorical parser. And it picks up the kinds of moves that you would typically want to see in a research paper or in a well-educated written piece or a good student essay. Moves such as establishing background knowledge or summarizing the piece and its goals and objectives or the claim being made. Generalizing or recognizing a kind of trend that seems to be emerging. Reporting some kind of novelty. So, at a certain point, you might actually have some new results to share. Or commenting on the significance of somebody's findings. or expressing surprise, or identifying missing knowledge of some sort, open questions, uncertainties, or contrasting ideas. I don't want just to see a laundry list of references and summaries of what they said. I want to see a critical engagement about how Bloggs differs from Smith and how the prediction by Jones is inconsistent with the finding reported by James, etc. Okay? It's knowing how to make those moves and make them visible. That's the mark of an educated mind. That's the mark of someone who is not just reading and sort of absorbing facts, but is starting to shape and express a voice. And so you can see a little example here that Zip classified the first sentence as being to do with novelty of some sort, and the second sentence as being a contrasting move of some sort. So rather than attempting to dum-de-dum-de-dum, our approach has been to, okay? Another example, the student has talked about problems in two places and is making a summarizing move here. In conclusion, I would suggest. So we're very interested in what a technology like this might mean for rapid formative feedback to students. And in one PhD by Bertrand Serenno, we studied in great detail through video how do users engage with a text that comes back to them marked up by a system like this. Can users actually annotate the text themselves using that ontology? There's a rich and complicated story there, which you can follow if you want. So that's one thing we're very interested in. And the other one is what we're calling dispositional analytics. What we're talking about here is your appetite for stretch and challenge. So Sir Richard Livingston, 1941, we're interested in the appetite to know and capacity to learn. This is 1941. This is not 21st century skills, but of course it is, because the only thing we can be sure about in the future is that it's going to be complex and uncertain, and the most strategic thing we can do is equip our students to be able to deal with that rather than panic because it's not something they've revised for. John Seeley Brown, in his brilliant way, is characterizing and synthesizing existing research in very effective ways. In his view, resilience will be the defining concept for the 21st century. What happens when your raft is upset? Can you bounce back? Can you come back stronger? Dispositions are now at least as important as knowledge and skills. Carol Dweck at Stanford talks about growth mindsets, where people believe that their abilities can be developed. They're not just bad at maths, and that's the end of it. And she talks about people being willing to take informed risks. Are you the kind of person who surrounds yourself with people who agree with you most of the time? Are you afraid of being found out not to know the right answer? Or is that okay? And we all know people of these sorts who are possibly in quite high leadership positions, who are actually quite brittle, quite defensive, and don't have that kind of growth mindset. Larry Rosenstock, amazing head at High Tech High in San Diego. For the innovation economy, dispositions come into play. Readiness to collaborate, attention to multiple perspectives, initiative, persistent curiosity. So over and over again now, educational thought leaders are talking about dispositions and mindsets. In the States, they talk about non-cognitive factors, which is always a strange expression to me, but it's the same thing. So the question is, do analytics have anything to offer us in getting a handle on these kinds of qualities? We know how to assess those things as humans, but what can a machine tell us? So the first step I've taken is working very closely with Ruth Deacon, who's at Bristol University. She's a visiting professor with me at the moment. And Ruth is using a traditional social science methodology, the good old survey tool, well validated psychometrically, validated in many different contexts, cultures, levels, abilities, ages, used with indigenous people here in Australia as well. And you get a survey which asks you about the way in which you approach your learning. The difference is your answers don't just disappear into a black hole and the researcher says thanks very much. Immediately you get a visual analytic that comes back, which provokes reflection. Just like that teacher spider diagram I showed you, this is a mirror held up to you of how you see yourself. And what Ruth has shown is this can be quite transformational for a learner if they then sit down and have a coaching conversation with somebody. And the kinds of things we're talking about here are taking responsibility for my own learning over time through defining my purposes, understanding, managing my feelings, sense-making, making connections between what I already know and new information, connecting what I'm learning to my own story and identity, hence the need for authentic inquiry and assessment. Creativity, being able to play out with ideas, willing to take risks. Curiosity, do you just do what you're told and get on with it, or do you push back, ask questions, wonder why and how, and dig deeper? Belonging, being part of a learning community at home or at school, in your social networks. Collaboration, knowing when it's good to work on your own and with others, wanting to learn and contribute. Hope and optimism. I mean, this is quite deep stuff. If you are hopeless and feeling disengaged and disempowered, that's a problem. So having a growth mindset, believing I can generate my own knowledge for what I need. And then there's a sort of a final dimension, which it's not good to be at either one end or the other, but to be sort of in the middle, which is an emotional orientation of being open and ready to invest in learning. So when an opportunity presents itself, whether it's in the lecture theatre or at home or on the street, you have an orientation and a mindset to engage and not be afraid. Okay. So that can be assessed through self-report. That can also be assessed through other ways. Teacher observation. From a learning analytics perspective, we want to say, that's good, that's extremely important. We need self-report in something that's this personal. But what about behavioral analytics? Could we imagine a platform generating a visualization like this? So for example, social network patterns or teamwork effectiveness or the initiation of relationships, we can imagine a platform knowing about those things increasingly. We can imagine a platform which reveals the kinds of connections you make between ideas. So if you're tagging a photo very differently from your peers, or if you're sharing a resource from one community into a completely different one, that says something about what you're seeing. Right? So even a user-generated social media platform might give you insights into the kinds of sense-making you're making. Okay? And of course, the way in which you write about stuff is a big window into the mind, and I've just talked about discourse analytics, writing analytics. Curiosity, well, language technologies can now pick up on questioning and arguing. I have a student who's looking at search behavior and how people talk about the searches they're finding. That reveals your epistemic mindset. What do you think counts as finding a good answer to a question? So just to wrap up then, I think we've got a huge opportunity here. And when you embed analytics into an infrastructure and it becomes part of the tool that is just there for students and educators, that's a very powerful move to make. But the danger is that it's brought into a particular set of categories. The danger, of course, is that sanctions start to become attached to it, and it's always a limited, filtered proxy for this mysterious, rich thing we call learning. So analytics are a good moment to ask, why do you want to count this stuff, and why? And who do you want to act on it, and how? And maybe we can use analytics as a vehicle. We've talked about a number of different vehicles, but maybe it's a Trojan horse to make it easier to evidence the more progressive kinds of learning that you care about. So if there was a tool that was integrated into your learning platform that actually made it easier to evidence some of these 21st century qualities and competencies, educators would probably start to use it if it was there and if it was well founded. This discourse is part of one which is taking root. There's a move to try and imagine universities which provide a holistic education. You go to reinventors.net and follow that link. There's a whole set of video roundtables with people talking about what if universities really took seriously the need to evidence these more holistic dimensions. If you're interested in the learning power spider diagram stuff, then learningemergence.net is where Ruth and I live. And you can hear, for example, from school children aged 10 talking about how their learning's been transformed because they have a language to talk about the process of their learning now. And finally, if you'll permit an advert for in a couple of weeks' time, you're very welcome to come to a Lassie at UTS where we'll have most of the key players in Australia who are interested in learning analytics coming and sharing how it's going in their institutions. The good, the bad, and the ugly, but constructive, friendly environment to come. So do come and join us there as well. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm sure all of you agree that it's been a very thought-provoking talk, so we're going to thank Simon Maloney.